April 7, 1944, 26,000 feet over Germany. Captain Benjamin Carter's P-51 Mustang screamed past a Focke-Wulf 190 inverted bleeding speed in a way that violated every combat manual ever written. The German pilot expected the American to recover level, expected him to complete a loop, expected predictable physics that training had ingrained into muscle memory and tactical doctrine. Instead, the Mustang rolled through the bottom of an impossible arc, transitioned into a diving turn that compressed enemy decision time to zero. The physics did not compute. The geometry made no sense. By the time the German understood what was happening, his wingman was already falling. Carter's 50 caliber tracers had found the second Focke-Wulf before it could react to maneuver that should not have existed. The maneuver had no name yet. Within 2 years, it would be taught at every fighter school from Nevada to England. But on this cold April morning over Bavaria, it was just mathematics applied by a man who trusted equations more than instinct. Carter pulled out of the dive, climbed back toward the bomber stream. His hands shook, not from fear but from understanding. Understanding that he had just proven something profound, proven that space between standard maneuvers contained solutions doctrine writers never imagined, proven that geometry could defeat tactics when executed with absolute precision, proven his brother's letters were not written in vain. Spring 1943, 1 year earlier. The air war over Europe was a grinding equation of altitude, speed, and ammunition. American bomber formations bled aircraft daily. German interceptors exploited predictable escort patterns with methodical efficiency. The math was simple and brutal. 8-hour missions, 30mm cannons, boys frozen at 23,000 feet. Dying because doctrine had no answer for tactics that evolved faster than training manuals could be rewritten. Fighter doctrine was rigid as steel girders. Energy equals survival. Never bleed speed in a turn. Never invert below 10,000 feet. Never sacrifice altitude for angle. The rulebook was written in the blood of those who improvised and died. Training manuals stressed consistency above innovation. Consistency meant predictability. Predictability should have meant death. Yet the doctrine persisted because it had worked in Spain and Poland in the early months over France. But the Germans had adapted. Focke-Wulf 190s no longer dogfought in horizontal circles that burned fuel and time. They slashed through formation at angles American escorts could not match. Dove from 30,000 feet, fired their cannons, climbed away before American fighters could respond. They exploited vertical space and raw power. American pilots were trained to turn, to circle, to leverage the Mustang's superior agility. But agility meant time. Time meant fuel. Fuel meant shorter escort ranges. The bombers died alone deeper into Germany. December 1942, 6 months before Carter would ship overseas. He sat at the family kitchen table in Kentucky reading a letter from his younger brother David, 22 years old, B-17 ball turret gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group stationed in England. David wrote every week. His letters were full of details other gunners never mentioned, not about fear or death or the numbing cold at altitude, about geometry, about watching German fighters slash through formations at angles American escorts could not match, about calculating closure rates from his cramped ball turret and understanding why doctrine failed mathematically. David's letter said, "Brother, the math does not work. Our escorts climbed to meet German fighters diving from 30,000 feet. By the time our P-47s reach intercept altitude, the Germans have fired and dived away. Our boys give chase. The Germans level out, accelerate, climb again before our fighters can close range. I sit in the ball turret calculating angles because there is nothing else to do while watching this happen. The Germans control when the fight starts. Our escorts react. Physics favors them. Speed plus gravity equals an advantage we cannot overcome with current tactics. I watch bombers burn because geometry defeats courage. Find a different equation, Ben. You are the engineer. Find a way to change the math." Carter read that letter 5 times. David was right. The problem was not courage or training or aircraft performance. The problem was pure geometry. Germans attacked along a predictable vector. High speed, clear approach, unobstructed field of fire. American escorts tried to climb and meet them, tried to turn with them, tried to outdive them. All reactive responses, all playing the German game on German terms. David's letters revealed a pattern no training manual acknowledged. Standard doctrine could not solve this specific tactical problem. New geometry was required. Someone willing to test edges doctrine forbade touching. Someone who trusted mathematics more than instinct. Benjamin Carter did not look like a man destined to rewrite fighter tactics. 24 years old, quiet, disciplined, thoughtful in a way that made other pilots uncomfortable. Born in Lexington, Kentucky in 1919, studied engineering at the University of Kentucky for 2 years before the war pulled him away from slide rules into cockpits. His Presbyterian upbringing taught him that problems had solutions if you calculated correctly. Engineering taught him that limits existed not as walls but as thresholds you could touch if you understood the physics governing them. He thought in tolerances and load limits and stress factors. The P-51 Mustang was not a romantic machine to him. It was a system. Lift, drag, thrust, and weight interacting according to laws that could be calculated, understood, and exploited. He knew the service ceiling by heart. 41,900 feet. He knew how many degrees the ailerons deflected at full throw. 25 degrees. He knew the stall speed at various bank angles, various altitudes, various fuel loads. Could calculate exactly how much speed he would lose in a 60-degree bank versus a 45-degree bank. Could predict precisely when the wing would stop producing lift and the aircraft would fall from the sky. This made him a strange fit among fighter pilots. Most flew on instinct and aggression and that indefinable quality called situational awareness. Carter flew on margins, on numbers, on calculations made before entering combat, so when combat arrived, he already knew the answers. He did not trust his gut. He trusted math. Math did not lie. Math did not panic. Math was consistent even when everything else was chaos. Before the war, he had worked summer jobs at airfields in Ohio, watched crop dusters bank steep and low over cornfields, saw what happened when a plane stalled in a turn, snap rolls, spins, ground rushing up fast, death arriving in seconds. But he also saw recovery, saw how a pilot could ride the edge of control and pull through if they understood where the edge was. If they knew exactly how much angle of attack the wing could sustain before airflow separated. If they understood physics rather than feared it. That was the lesson Carter absorbed watching those barnstormers. The edge existed. The edge could be touched. The edge could be survived if you understood exactly where it was. At flight school, instructors taught energy management like gospel. Speed is life. Altitude is life insurance. Every combat turn costs both. The key is to cost your enemy more. Force them to bleed speed faster. Force them to turn tighter. Stay above them, behind them, faster than them. The doctrine was sound, based on combat experience from Spain, from China, from the early war over Europe. Carter learned it, respected it, memorized every principle, then quietly began testing where it bent, where the assumptions broke down, where new geometry might exist. On training flights, he practiced alone when instructors were not watching. High-speed rolls, inverted passes, hammerhead stalls, nothing reckless, nothing that risked the aircraft or violated flight safety, just exploration. He wanted to know what the Mustang felt like at the edge. He learned the buffet and the stick when the wing was about to let go of the air. Learned how much rudder compensated for adverse yaw in a slow roll. Learned how the plane responded when you stopped fighting it and started guiding it through maneuvers with understanding rather than force. This was geometry the instructors never taught because the instructors followed the manual, and the manual assumed certain maneuvers were impossible or suicidal or both. March 1943, training base in Texas. Carter's instructor was Captain William Bradford, 42 years old, veteran of early war missions over France before being rotated back to train new pilots. Bradford taught energy management by the book. Every word, every principle. Speed is life. Altitude is life insurance. Maintain your energy. Force the enemy to bleed energy. Stay above behind faster. The doctrine was carved into Bradford's soul. He flew it, breathed it, taught it to every student like commandments from a mountain. Carter learned from Bradford, respected him, understood that doctrine existed for reasons written in the blood of pilots who had ignored it. Bradford died in April 1943. Operational training mission over the English Channel. Engaged a single Focke-Wulf 190, followed doctrine perfectly. Tried to outturn the German in a horizontal fight. The Mustang could do it, had superior turn radius, could outcircle a Focke-Wulf given enough time and space. But the German did not turn. He slashed through the initial pass, fired his cannons, climbed away using superior dive speed and vertical energy. Bradford gave chase following what the manual taught, maintained his energy, tried to close range, tried to position for a shot. The German leveled out at altitude, extended using superior straight-line speed, climbed again before Bradford could catch him. Bradford followed into the vertical fight, zoom climbed trying to gain position, lost energy at the top of the climb. The Mustang was slower, lighter, could not match the Focke-Wulf in vertical energy retention. Bradford stalled at the apex, hung there for a moment that felt like eternity to the observers watching from below. The German reversed. Dove. Fired. Bradford's Mustang fell trailing fire and smoke. Carter attended the funeral, listened to the eulogies praising Bradford's adherence to training, proper execution of maneuvers, following the rules that kept most pilots alive most of the time. Carter understood differently. Bradford had died not from failure to follow the book, but from the book's failure to account for an opponent who understood its limitations. The Germans had read the same manuals, knew the same tactics, exploited the predictability that doctrine created. They knew Americans would try to turn. Knew Americans would maintain energy. Knew Americans would follow patterns that training had ingrained. So Germans developed tactics that avoided American strengths and exploited doctrine's assumptions. Bradford flew perfectly and died perfectly because perfect was predictable and predictable was vulnerable. Carter decided that day. He would find the space doctrine did not cover. Would test the edges Bradford never dared touch because Bradford had trusted the book absolutely. Would develop geometry that changed the equation David's letters described. Would solve the tactical problem, killing his brother's bomber formations. Would do it by understanding physics more completely than anyone else. Would do it by calculating precisely where the edges were and learning to touch them without dying. Would do it because mathematics demanded solutions and war demanded results, and his brother demanded that someone find the answer before he became a statistic. May 1943. Carter shipped overseas. Joined the 361st Fighter Group at Debden Airfield in Essex. Assigned a crew chief named Charlie Morrison, 38 years old, from Montana, had worked on barnstorming planes before the war. Understood aircraft not as mysterious machines but as systems with calculable limits. Most crew chiefs worried when pilots pushed boundaries. Morrison was different. He wanted to know the math, wanted to understand the tolerances, wanted to verify the calculations before the aircraft executed them. Carter showed Morrison his notebook, diagrams he had drawn during months of thinking about David's letters, curved arrows representing flight paths, numbers scribbled in the margins calculating stress loads, equations for roll rates at high speed, inverted lift coefficients, load factors during transition maneuvers that existed between standard loops and standard dives. Most crew chiefs would have reported a pilot for dangerous thinking, would have worried about the aircraft being stressed beyond design limits, would have refused to support innovation that risked plane and pilot. Morrison studied the diagrams differently, asked questions about the numbers, calculated the stress on the airframe using specifications he had memorized, checked the tolerances against the loads Carter's geometry would generate. Then Morrison said something that changed everything. He said, "Math is good. If you execute precisely at the speeds you calculated, she will hold together. I will make sure she holds together. You find the geometry. I will keep the machine capable of executing it." A partnership formed in that moment. Carter would test the maneuvers. Morrison would verify the aircraft could survive them. Together, they would develop tactics that exploited the space between doctrine's standard responses. Would touch the edges safely because they understood exactly where the edges were. Would prove that mathematics could defeat instinct when mathematics was applied with precision that left no room for error or improvisation. Carter tested over the English countryside at high altitude, where mistakes meant time to recover rather than immediate death. Practice rolls at speeds the manual said were dangerous. Inverted passes at altitudes the manual said were suicidal. Hammerhead stalls that the manual said would result in unrecoverable spins. Nothing reckless. Everything calculated. He wanted to know what the Mustang felt like at the edge, wanted to memorize the buffet in the stick when the wing was about to stop flying, wanted to understand how much rudder was too much, how much was too little, how much was exactly right for each maneuver at each speed at each altitude. Morrison inspected after every flight, checked for stress cracks in the airframe, examined rivet lines for signs of excessive loads, measured control surface deflections to verify they matched the calculations, confirmed the aircraft could sustain the loads Carter's geometry required without structural failure. Other pilots noticed that Carter flew differently. The squadron called him the professor. Not affectionately, not with warmth or camaraderie, with the suspicion and distance reserved for those who did not fit the standard mold. Carter did not talk much during briefings, did not engage in ready-room banter about women or gambling or drinking. His flight logs were strange. He returned from missions with less ammunition expended than others, more fuel remaining, fewer hits taken. His kill confirmations were often listed as probable because no one else had witnessed them. They happened too fast or too far from the formation. Happened in vertical space where other pilots did not venture because doctrine said that space belonged to the enemy. Captain Robert Mitchell was a senior pilot with 12 confirmed kills and the authority that came with survival. He asked questions during debriefs. How did you get that angle? Why did you not maintain formation? Why did you climb when doctrine says to extend? Carter shrugged, said he had calculated differently, said geometry suggested an alternative approach, said the math supported his decision. Mitchell did not appreciate the responses, said war was not a mathematics exam, said innovation meant death, said doctrine existed because it worked and changing it risked everyone. Carter said nothing more, understood that Mitchell believed absolutely in the book, understood that arguing was futile, understood he would have to prove that geometry worked before anyone would listen. But Carter almost did not get the chance to prove anything. Training instructors at the Texas base had flagged him for dangerous flying. Not because he had crashed, not because he had violated procedures in ways that harmed others, because he practiced maneuvers not in the manual. Rolled inverted at altitudes lower than safety margins specified, tested stall recovery in unusual attitudes. Explored margins doctrine said were forbidden territory reserved for dying, not flying. The flight commander wanted to wash him out, said Carter did not respect the rules, said innovation in combat meant death because combat left no room for experimentation, said pilots who followed the book lived and pilots who improvised died, and the statistics proved this absolutely. Carter appealed the decision, argued that testing limits in training meant understanding them in combat, argued that the Germans were adapting constantly, that doctrine written for 1940 Spain did not account for 1943 Germany, argued that mathematics supported the maneuvers instructors called impossible. He showed his calculations, demonstrated on a chalkboard that inverted flight at certain speeds generated a lift coefficient sufficient to maintain control, proved that rolling through the bottom of an arc rather than completing a full loop preserved energy while changing geometry faster than the enemy could recalculate. The review board was split. Half wanted him gone. Half saw potential. A compromise emerged. Carter could graduate but would be watched closely. Any violation of doctrine in combat would mean immediate grounding. Any losses attributed to his tactics would mean court-martial. Any proof that innovation harmed squadron effectiveness would end his career. Carter accepted the terms. Understood he would have to prove the geometry worked through results, through kills, through bringing pilots home, through changing the statistics that currently favor German tactics over American doctrine. January 12, 1944. 3 months before the April 7th maneuver would prove everything. Carter flew an escort mission to Schweinfurt. His brother David's bomber group was in the formation. Carter knew this because David had written the week before about the upcoming mission to the ball-bearing factories, about expecting heavy resistance, about understanding that this mission was critical and dangerous. Carter had requested assignment to David's escort. The request was approved. He would protect his brother through geometry that doctrine could not provide. Would ensure David came home because mathematics would defeat tactics. The mission went wrong from the start. Cloud cover thicker than forecast separated the bomber stream into scattered elements. German fighters appeared in force. 20-plus Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts rising from airfields across Germany. Carter's flight engaged following standard intercept procedures, climbing to meet the diving Germans, turning to position for deflection shots, maintaining formation integrity, playing by the book. But the book had no answer for what happened next. The Germans slashed through the bomber formation in coordinated attacks, high-speed passes from multiple angles. They fired their cannons, climbed away before the American escorts could close range. Carter chased one FW-190 into a vertical fight, both aircraft trading speed for altitude, climbing toward the sun. At the apex, the German rolled smoothly, dove away using gravity and superior dive speed. Carter tried to follow, lost sight momentarily in the sun glare. By the time he recovered, the German was gone, and the bomber stream had moved miles to the east. Carter raced back to the formation, found chaos, found smoke trails, found bombers struggling with damaged engines, found his brother's B-17. David's bomber trailed smoke from the number 2 engine. The left wing showed damage from cannon fire. The aircraft was falling behind the formation, losing altitude, becoming a target for German fighters who circled wounded prey like sharks drawn to blood. Carter tried to escort it home, stayed close, scanned constantly for threats. 2 FW-190s appeared at 4 o'clock high. Carter engaged, shot down one in a deflection shot that burned the last of his ammunition. The second German escaped before Carter could close, but the damage was done. David's bomber could not maintain altitude on 3 engines with wing damage bleeding lift. The crew bailed out over France. Carter watched the parachutes deploy, counted them, counted 10 white canopies against the gray French countryside. The full crew had survived the bailout, but they were prisoners now, would spend the rest of the war in German camps, captured because Carter had followed doctrine, because standard tactics could not protect bombers from geometry that favored attacking fighters over defending escorts. That night, Carter sat in the barracks writing a letter to his mother, Sarah, back in Kentucky. He told her that David was alive, but captured. Told her that he had failed, not through cowardice, not through incompetence, through adherence to doctrine that could not solve the problem German tactics presented. He told her he would find the answer, would develop a maneuver that changed the equation, would ensure that other brothers came home to other mothers, would prove that geometry could defeat tactics when executed with understanding that went beyond what the manuals taught, would not fail again, would not watch another bomber fall because doctrine assumed combat worked a certain way when reality proved different. He did not mail the letter, kept it, a reminder of what failure looked like, a reminder that following the rules perfectly could still result in defeat when the enemy refused to fight on those terms. A reminder that David sat in a German camp because his big brother had trusted the book more than mathematics. That changed. Carter stopped trusting the book, started trusting the numbers, started calculating the geometry that existed between standard maneuvers, started developing tactics that would compress German decision time to 0, started testing maneuvers that would prove mathematics defeated instinct, started preparing for April 7, 1944, when everything would change, when the impossible would become inevitable, when geometry would defeat tactics, when one pilot's refusal to accept doctrine as gospel would begin changing how thousands flew, when the space between standard responses would reveal solutions that saved lives, when mathematics would prove superior to instinct, when Benjamin Carter would roll inverted at 26,000 feet over Germany and change fighter combat forever. April 7, 1944. The mission to Munich launched under clear skies, calm winds, good visibility. German fighters were expected. Intelligence had reported increased Luftwaffe activity around the industrial targets. Carter's flight was assigned high cover. They orbited above the bomber stream at 26,000 feet. The cold seeped through gloves and boots no matter how many layers you wore. Breath fogged the canopy. The world was silent, except for the engine's steady roar and the occasional crackle of radio static. Below the bomber formation looked like a swarm of metal insects crawling across the European landscape, fragile, vulnerable, dependent on escorts who had failed too many times. Bandits called in, 3 o'clock high. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s diving through the formation 2,000 feet above. The attack was textbook, steep angle, high speed, cannons firing in short controlled bursts, A bomber on the left side of the formation trailed smoke from its number 3 engine. The Germans pulled out of their Boeing and began their climb. Standard procedure. They knew the American escorts would try to intercept. Knew they would climb to meet them. Knew the physics favored the attackers. Carter's element was too far to the right. By the time they turned toward the threat, the Germans were already ascending. Carter pushed the throttle forward. War emergency power. The Merlin engine responded with a surge that pressed him back into his seat. He nosed up into a zoom climb, trading speed for altitude. The Mustang pointed toward the sky. The Germans saw him coming. They continued climbing. They knew he could not reach them. Had seen this scenario play out 100 times before. The American would climb until his speed bled away, would stall or fall back. They would escape, would reposition, would attack again. This was the pattern. This was how the geometry worked. This was why they owned the vertical space. But Carter did not follow the pattern. At the top of his climb, as his airspeed bled through 160 knots, he did something no doctrine permitted. He rolled inverted. It was smooth. No hesitation, no doubt. Just execution of mathematics he had calculated 1,000 times. He held the stick neutral and let the nose drop through the horizon upside down. Gravity pulled the plane through the arc. The controls stayed responsive because he had calculated the exact speed where inverted lift would sustain controlled flight. He was not looping, not diving vertically, was rolling through an arc that kept his energy high and changed his angle faster than any standard reversal could achieve. This was the geometry that existed between maneuvers. The space doctrine never acknowledged. The solution David's letters had demanded. The lead German pilot saw the Mustang invert. His training told him what would happen next. The American would complete a loop or execute a split S. Standard recovery maneuvers. Predictable geometry. He adjusted his climb angle to avoid the anticipated flight path. Positioned himself to exploit the American's vulnerability during recovery. But Carter did not follow the anticipated path. He rolled upright halfway through the descent, pulled into a high G turn that put him inside the German's arc. Physics compressed the enemy's decision time. The Focke-Wulf pilot's brain needed 3 seconds to recognize the threat, needed 2 more seconds to react, needed another second to begin evasive maneuver. Carter's bullets arrived in 4 seconds. The geometry gave the German no time to recalculate. Carter fired, a 2-second burst. 50 caliber rounds punched through the wing root. The Focke-Wulf shuddered, pieces separated. Control surfaces tore away. The aircraft entered a spin it could not recover from, spiraled down trailing fire and smoke, and proof that mathematics could defeat instinct. Carter pulled out of his turn, scanned for the wingman. The second German was running, diving away at full throttle, abandoning his leader, abandoning the fight. Carter did not chase. Climbed back to the bombers. His own winged man, Lieutenant Tommy Walsh, radioed with voice tight with awe and confusion. He said, "What the hell was that?" Carter did not answer immediately, did not have words for what he had done. The maneuver existed in his calculations, in his notebook diagrams, in the hours Morrison had spent checking tolerances, but existed nowhere in doctrine, nowhere in training, nowhere except in the space between what everyone assumed was possible and what mathematics proved could be achieved. Finally, he keyed his radio, said simply, "Geometry." After landing, the debrief was tense. The small room smelled of cigarette smoke and tension. Carter reported the kill. The intelligence officer asked him to describe the maneuver. Carter tried, talked about roll rates and inverted lift, explained how the roll preserved energy while changing geometry, how the transition happened in space the enemy did not expect, how physics compressed their decision time below human reaction threshold. The officer listened, wrote notes in careful script, asked clarifying questions about altitude and airspeed, then said words Carter did not expect. The officer said, "Do not try it again. It is not in the manual. If other pilots attempt it without understanding the mechanics, they will die. You got lucky today. Luck runs out. Stick to doctrine. That is an order." Carter wanted to argue, wanted to explain it was not luck, was mathematics, was geometry applied with precision that eliminated chance from the equation, was solution to problem that had killed his brother's bomber crew. But he understood that arguing would accomplish nothing. Command thought in terms of doctrine and safety margins and keeping pilots alive through consistency. Innovation looked like chaos to them, looked like risk they could not quantify or control. So Carter nodded, said he understood, left the debriefing room understanding he had proven the concept but not convinced the command. Would need more evidence, more results, more pilots surviving because geometry changed the equation. That night, Charlie Morrison found him at the hard stand. The crew chief inspected the Mustang under portable lights that cast harsh shadows. Morrison checked for stress damage from the high G turn, examined the wings for signs of overstress, looked for wrinkles in the skin that would indicate the airframe had been pushed beyond design limits. He found evidence of the inverted flight in the oil distribution patterns, found marks from the violent maneuver, but found no damage, no cracks, no failures. Oh. Morrison straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, said she held together. Your math was right. Carter said command says to stop. Morrison said command says many things. You gonna listen? Carter did not answer. The answer was obvious. Written in his brother's capture. Written in the bombers that burned daily because doctrine had no solution. Written in the mathematics that proved geometry could defeat tactics. He would continue. Would refine the maneuver. Would wait for the next opportunity to prove it worked. Would document everything so when the time came, he could show command that innovation saved lives rather than cost them. 3 weeks later, April 28, 1944. Larger mission, more bombers, more escorts, more Germans. The Luftwaffe was sending up everything they had, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts and even outdated 109s flown by green pilots desperate to stop the bleeding. Carter's squadron was jumped from above. 4 German fighters in a coordinated attack. High-speed passes from multiple angles. The formation scattered. Pilots broke in all directions, responding to immediate threats. Individual fights erupted across miles of sky. Carter broke right, climbed hard. At the top of his zoom, he rolled inverted and transitioned into the diving turn. It happened faster this time, smoother. He knew the feel now, knew exactly when to roll, when to transition, when to pull. The Mustang responded like it had been built for this maneuver, like the engineers at North American Aviation had somehow anticipated this geometry without knowing it. One German fighter tried to follow him through the roll. The pilot was brave, skilled, but did not understand the mathematics. Rolled too slowly. The nose dropped too steep. The Focke-Wulf fell through the maneuver rather than transitioning smoothly. The German stalled, entered a spin. Carter did not need to fire. The plane was already dead, already falling toward the Bavarian forest below. Physics had killed it more efficiently than bullets ever could. Lieutenant Tommy Walsh saw the whole thing, 22 years old. Carter's wingman for 6 missions now. Young, aggressive, wanted to prove himself, wanted kills on his record, wanted to be more than just someone's wingman. Walsh watched Carter execute the maneuver twice now. Watched it work both times, watched German fighters die or flee because geometry defeated their tactics. Walsh decided he could do it too. Decided the maneuver was not as impossible as it looked. Decided that if Carter could execute it, so could he. On the next engagement, Walsh tried it. A Messerschmitt dove past him. Walsh pulled up into a zoom climb. At the apex, he rolled inverted just like he had seen Carter do. But Walsh did not understand the mathematics, did not know the precise airspeed required, did not calculate the load factors, did not understand how roll rate and airspeed and angle of attack all had to align perfectly. He rolled too slowly. The nose dropped too steep. His airspeed was 15 knots too low. The Mustang fell through the bottom of the arc. Walsh pulled hard on the stick, trying to recover. 7 Gs, 8 Gs. The edges of his vision grayed out. Blood pooled in his lower body. He fought to stay conscious, fought to maintain control of aircraft that was no longer flying but falling with engines still running. His vision tunneled to pinpoint. The world went gray, then black. Walsh blacked out at 24,000 feet, came to at 23,000. Alone. Disoriented. No idea where the German was. No idea where his formation was. Just sky and clouds and the terrible understanding that he had almost died not from enemy action, but from attempting maneuver he did not understand. He limped back to base on shaking hands, landed with adrenaline still coursing through his veins. After the debriefing, Walsh found Carter in the crew room. His voice shook, not from fear but from anger mixed with confusion and the aftermath of nearly dying. He said, "You almost killed me. That maneuver is insane. I rolled inverted like you did. The plane fell through. I could not control it. Blacked out pulling G's trying to recover. If that German had been there, I would be dead right now." Carter listened. Let Walsh finish. Let him vent the fear and anger. Then ask questions. What was your airspeed at roll initiation? Walsh did not know. What was the load factor during transition? Walsh had not calculated it. Did you compensate for adverse yaw? Walsh looked confused. Did not understand the question. Carter understood the problem immediately. Walsh had seen the result. Had not understood the process. Had tried to copy without comprehending the mathematics. Had attempted geometry without calculating the edges. That was the difference between execution and disaster. Carter said the maneuver is not insane. Attempting it without understanding physics is insane. Math determines whether you live or die. If you calculate correctly, it works every time. If you guess, you die every time. Walsh asked, can you teach it? Can an average pilot learn this? Or does it require some kind of instinct that cannot be taught? Carter thought for a long time. Considered the question carefully. Considered whether geometry could be taught or whether some understanding was innate. Then said it requires math. If you know the stall speed, the roll rate, the load limits, you can do it. If you guess, you die. I will teach you. But only if you understand you are learning physics, not a trick. Only if you commit to calculating before attempting. Only if you respect that this is mathematics, not magic. Walsh agreed. Carter spent the next 2 weeks teaching him, not in the aircraft, on the ground, with diagrams drawn on chalkboards in empty briefing rooms, with calculations written out step by step. Understanding lift vectors throughout the maneuver. Understanding when inverted lift pushes you through the arc rather than fighting it. Understanding roll rate versus airspeed versus load factor. Understanding that every variable had to be calculated precisely because imprecision meant death. Walsh learned slowly, asked questions, made mistakes on paper instead of in the air. Eventually understood the geometry completely. Only then did Carter let him try it in the aircraft. Walsh executed it perfectly. Became the first pilot besides Carter to use the maneuver successfully in combat. Proved it could be taught. Proved mathematics could be transferred through careful instruction. Proved doctrine could be expanded if pilots understood the science behind innovation. May 15, 1944. 3,000 miles east. Luftwaffe base outside Munich. Hauptmann Klaus Werner watched from the debriefing room as his pilots described the American maneuver. Werner was 29 years old. Experienced ace with 38 bomber kills. Intelligent, analytical, student of tactics and geometry. He had seen combat over Spain, over Poland, over Russia. Understood aerial combat as three-dimensional geometry played out at high speed with death as the price of miscalculation. When his pilots described the American Mustang doing something impossible, Werner listened carefully. They said the Mustang had rolled inverted at the top of a zoom climb, had transitioned into a diving attack that appeared from an angle they did not anticipate, had compressed decision time to nothing, had killed Werner's best wingman before the man could react. The description fascinated Werner. He asked for details, drew diagrams based on what his pilots described, calculated what he was hearing, understood this was not luck or desperation, was calculated maneuver that exploited geometry in new way, was innovation that changed the tactical balance. Werner requested permission from his squadron commander to test a countermaneuver, to develop a response. The commander approved. Werner was their best. If anyone could solve the American innovation, Werner could. May 22, 1944. Werner took off alone. Solo test flight. High altitude where mistakes could be recovered. Plenty of room for error. He climbed to 26,000 feet over Bavaria. Initiated a zoom climb like the Americans did. At the apex, he rolled inverted. Tried to transition into the diving turn his pilots had described. But Werner misjudged. The Focke-Wulf 190 was heavier than the Mustang. Different roll characteristics, different load tolerances, different stall behavior. Werner rolled too aggressively, trying to match what Americans did in lighter aircraft. The nose dropped too steep. The Focke-Wulf accelerated into a dive Werner could not control. He pulled hard on the stick. 6 Gs, 7 Gs. The aircraft shuddered. The airframe protested. Something snapped. A control cable or a structural member. The plane entered an inverted spin. Werner fought the controls, applied opposite rudder, reduced throttle, tried every recovery technique he knew. Nothing worked. The Focke-Wulf fell, spinning, inverted. Terminal. Werner had time to think as the ground rushed up. Time to understand he had attempted maneuver without complete information, without understanding the aircraft's specific tolerances, without calculating the margins precisely. Had tried to copy American innovation using German aircraft with different characteristics. The mathematics did not transfer directly. Required recalculation for different airframe, different weight, different performance envelope. Werner understood this in his final seconds. Understood he was dying because he had attempted geometry without complete understanding. The Focke-Wulf hit the forest outside Munich at 400 miles per hour. The impact created a crater 30 feet wide. Werner died instantly. Became a casualty of innovation. Proof that copying tactics without understanding mathematics was fatal. German intelligence analyzed the wreckage, studied Werner's notes from his cockpit, flight recorder data, understood the maneuver required specific aircraft characteristics, required precise airspeed, required understanding exactly how much G-force the airframe could sustain during transition. Werner had possessed skill and courage and intelligence, but did not have complete mathematics, did not understand the tolerances specific to American Mustang versus German Focke-Wulf, had attempted geometry without full comprehension of variables. Luftwaffe command prohibited further replication attempts, classified the American maneuver as dangerous to copy, ordered pilots to avoid vertical engagements with Mustangs that exhibited this capability, began developing new tactics that acknowledged American innovation and avoided its strengths. Werner's death taught them that some geometry belonged to specific aircraft, that innovation was not always transferable, that attempting to copy without understanding could kill your best pilots. June 1944. Colonel James Reynolds summoned Carter to his office, 42 years old, commander of the 361st Fighter Group. Tough, fair, exhausted from losing too many pilots to tactics that worked until they did not. Reynolds had reviewed the intelligence reports, had read the after-action accounts, had analyzed the statistics. Squadrons where pilots attempted Carter's maneuver had complex results. Some pilots died in training. Others survived and began achieving kills at rates that exceeded doctrine-based pilots. German fighters were breaking off engagements rather than pressing attacks against formations with Carter-trained escorts. Loss rates showed measurable decline where the maneuver was understood, but showed increase where it was attempted without proper training. Reynolds looked at Carter across his desk, said, "Your maneuver is not sanctioned. It is not safe. It is not in the manual. But it works. Intelligence shows German fighters avoiding combat with pilots who can execute it. Our loss rates are dropping in squadrons where pilots understand it. Problem is pilots attempting it without understanding. Getting killed. Hauptmann-Werner crashed trying to replicate it. American pilots are dying in training attempting to copy what they saw you do." Carter said nothing, waited. Reynolds continued, "Can it be taught? Can it be standardized? Can average pilots execute it safely?" Carter said. "With proper instruction, yes. It requires teaching physics first, execution second. Requires pilots to calculate rather than improvise. Requires understanding the margins. Requires practice at safe altitude with someone who knows what to watch for." Reynolds made his decision, said, "I am authorizing a limited training program. You will teach selected pilots, experienced only. Must demonstrate understanding of theory before attempting an aircraft. Must practice at altitude with instructor monitoring. Any pilot who attempts without authorization will be grounded. Any instructor who teaches improperly will face court-martial. This is unofficial. If questioned by higher command, I will deny knowledge. You will document the process. If it works, we formalize it. If pilots die, we stop." Understood. Carter understood. Spent the next 3 months developing a training syllabus. Typed it on onion skin paper. Distributed it to a handful of experienced pilots who demonstrated aptitude for precision flying. The document described a high-speed rolling reversal with inverted transition. No fancy name, just geometry and speeds and angles and warnings. Required pilots to calculate their specific aircraft's tolerances. Required practice at safe altitude above 20,000 feet. Required demonstration of understanding before combat application. Some pilots mastered it in a week. Others never tried. A few crashed, not in combat, in training. Reynolds stood by the program, argued that deaths in training prevented more deaths in combat. Statistics supported this argument. Squadrons using the maneuver had lower overall loss rates despite training casualties. Math proved innovations saved more lives than it cost. By August 1944, the maneuver was being practiced over the English countryside. Instructors watched from below, called corrections over radio, monitored airspeed and altitude in execution. Command debated whether to ban it outright or formalize it into doctrine. Debate lasted months. Meanwhile, pilots kept using it in combat, kept surviving encounters that should have killed them, kept bringing bombers home that should have burned, kept proving that geometry could defeat tactics when geometry was executed with absolute precision. Mathematics was changing warfare. One maneuver at a time, one pilot at a time, one mission at a time. Carter's refusal to accept that doctrine was finished, was rewriting how aerial combat worked, was proving that space between standard responses contained solutions that could save thousands of lives, was demonstrating that innovation required understanding rather than inspiration, that mathematics mattered more than instinct, that geometry could defeat any tactic when applied with precision that eliminated chance from the equation. May 1946, 1 year after the war ended. Benjamin Carter stood at the processing center in New York, watching former prisoners of war shuffle through documentation lines. Men who had survived German camps. Men who looked older than their years. Thinner. Harder. Changed in ways that peace could not immediately heal. Carter scanned faces looking for one specific person. Looking for his brother. Looking for the reason he had developed geometry that changed warfare. Then he saw him. David Carter was 24 years old now. Should have been young, should have been full of the energy and optimism that came from survival. Instead, he looked like an old man wearing a young man's face, thin to the point of gaunt, eyes that had seen too much, movements careful and economical as if conserving energy from years of rationing, but alive, completely and undeniably alive. The brothers saw each other across the crowded room, did not run, did not shout, just walked toward each other with the gravity of men who understood what survival cost. They embraced, said nothing, did not need words. The mathematics of their relationship had been proven. David had identified the problem. Ben had found the solution. Both had survived to see the equation balanced. They returned to Kentucky together on a train that rattled through countryside unchanged by war, fought 3,000 miles away. David slept most of the journey, exhausted in ways that went deeper than physical. Ben watched him sleep and thought about the letters that had started everything. The calculations David had made from a ball turret, the geometry that had revealed doctrine's failure, the brother who had demanded someone find a better answer. Ben had found it, had proven it, had changed how thousands of pilots flew. But looking at David's sleeping face, he wondered if the solution had come too late, if the 2 years in Stalag Luft III had cost more than mathematics could ever repay. Their mother, Sarah, met them at Lexington Station. 50 years old, gray hair that had been brown when her sons left for war. She cried for 3 days straight, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it could only be expressed through tears. Both sons home, both alive. Statistics said at least one should have died. Mathematics said survival was improbable. Yet here they were, proof that sometimes equations resolved in ways probability could not predict. Sarah cooked everything her sons had missed. Fried chicken and cornbread and apple pie. Watched them eat with satisfaction that went beyond nourishment. This was proof they were home, proof the war was finished, proof mathematics had worked in their favor. David recovered slowly. The physical weight came back first. Proper food after years of watery soup and black bread. Then the color returned to his face, the energy to his movements. But the nightmares persisted. He would wake screaming about fire and falling and friends who did not survive other missions, about guilt that consumed him for surviving when better men had died, about confusion over why physics had saved him, but not them. Ben sat with him during those nights, did not offer empty comfort, offered what he had, offered mathematics, explained how he had developed the maneuver, how David's letters about geometry had revealed the pattern, how understanding the problem had led to the solution, how that solution had spread until it changed doctrine itself. David asked the question that mattered most. He said, "How many bombers did it save?" Ben said, "Cannot calculate exactly, but squadrons using it had measurably lower loss rates. Bomber formations with escorts trained in the maneuver experienced fewer successful German intercepts. Intelligence estimates suggest hundreds of bombers, maybe thousands, maybe more. The geometry kept spreading. Pilots taught other pilots. The maneuver evolved. By war's end, it was standard in some squadrons, unofficial doctrine in others. Your letters mattered. You saw the problem. I found the answer. We did this together." David sat quiet for a long time, processing this, understanding that his 2 years in captivity had purchased something, had created motivation that led to innovation that saved lives he would never meet, that his suffering had meaning beyond survival, that mathematics had transformed personal tragedy into collective salvation. He said, "My letters mattered." The words came out like prayer, like absolution, like understanding that suffering could produce purpose if someone cared enough to calculate solutions. September 1948, 3 years after the war, Carter received a letter from Germany, from a woman named Greta Werner, widow of Hauptmann Klaus Werner, the Luftwaffe ace who had died attempting to replicate Carter's maneuver. The letter was formal, polite, written in careful English that showed education and effort. Greta explained that she had obtained Carter's name through military records, wanted to understand what her husband had attempted, wanted to know why Klaus had died, wanted to help make sense of sacrifice that felt meaningless without understanding. Carter wrote back, explained the maneuver in technical detail, explained the physics, explained that different aircraft had different characteristics, that the Focke-Wulf 190 was heavier than the P-51 Mustang, had different roll rates, different load tolerances, different stall behaviors. Explained that Klaus had been skilled but had attempted geometry without complete information, that trying to copy American innovation using German aircraft with different specifications had been fatal, that many American pilots had also died learning the maneuver, that innovation carried cost measured in lives of those who explored its edges, that Klaus had died pursuing tactical excellence, that his sacrifice had taught both sides that some geometry was aircraft-specific, that his death had meaning even in failure. Greta wrote back, thanked him for the explanation, said understanding helped with grief that had no other resolution, said Klaus would have appreciated the technical clarity, said he had always respected opponents who thought strategically rather than just fought aggressively. Then she wrote something unexpected, something that would change everything. She wrote, "I must tell you the truth. Klaus did not die in that crash, was severely injured, spent a year in hospital. Luftwaffe reported him killed because injuries ended his flying career. After war, we moved to Hamburg. Klaus became aeronautical engineer, designs civilian aircraft now, has wanted to meet you for years, wanted to understand the maneuver that defeated him. I am writing to ask if you would consider visiting Germany, meeting the man who tried to kill you, who you tried to kill, who both survived to become something other than enemies." Carter showed the letter to Helen, his wife now, married in 1946. She was a nurse he had met in England. Practical, direct, understood men who carried war in ways that never fully healed. She read the letter twice, then said, "War is over. Grief remains for everyone. If meeting him helps both of you process what happened, go. Maybe understanding can follow violence. Maybe enemies can become something else when killing stops being necessary." October 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Carter traveled to Hamburg, expected to meet a widow, found something different. Greta met him at the train station. With her was Klaus Werner, alive, 50 years old, walking with a pronounced limp, left arm stiff from injuries that never fully healed, face scarred on one side from impact that should have killed him, but alive, unmistakably and undeniably alive. Carter stared, did not know what to say, how to reconcile the dead enemy with the living man standing before him. They went to a cafe, sat across a small table. Two former enemies, both engineers now, both understood geometry, both knew what it meant to calculate death and survival. Klaus spoke first. His English was accented but clear. He said, "Captain Carter, I tried to kill you 20 years ago. You tried to kill me. War demanded this of us. But war is over. I need to understand what you developed. I saw your maneuver once in combat, saw it kill my wingman, reported it to intelligence, tried to replicate it, nearly died, spent a year in hospital recovering from injuries, spent 20 years wondering how you conceived it, how you calculated it, how you taught others, why it worked for Americans but nearly killed me when I attempted it," Carter explained. "Used napkins to draw diagrams, explained lift vectors during inverted transition, explained how the Mustang's lighter weight and higher roll rate made the maneuver feasible within its design tolerances, explained how the Focke-Wulf's different characteristics required different execution, different speeds, different angles, different load management, explained that Klaus had attempted the geometry without complete information, without understanding aircraft-specific margins, that attempting to copy without full mathematical comprehension was what nearly killed him. Klaus listened, asked technical questions, calculated on his own napkin, nodded slowly as understanding dawned, then said something Carter did not expect. He said, "You changed warfare, not through superior numbers or better weapons, through superior understanding of physics. You found space we did not know existed, found geometry that defeated our tactics. Many pilots died learning it. I nearly died attempting it. But you persisted, taught it systematically, made it doctrine. That is strategic innovation. That is engineering under pressure. I respect this deeply. I wish we had met as engineers instead of as enemies. We could have designed aircraft together instead of trying to kill each other with them." They talked for 6 hours about the maneuver and its evolution, about engineering and design, about how both had returned to civilian aviation after the war, about understanding that enemies could become colleagues when warfare ended, about the shared language of mathematics that transcended nationalism, about geometry belonging to physics rather than to countries. Klaus said, "I have designed civilian aircraft for 20 years, have tried to incorporate lessons from combat, have thought often about your maneuver, about how innovation requires understanding rather than imitation, about how copying without comprehension kills as surely as enemy fire. You taught me this lesson at terrible cost, but you taught well. I am better engineer because I survived trying to understand your geometry." They exchanged addresses, promised to correspond about aviation design, began an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect for mathematics and shared understanding of what combat had cost them both. Proof that geometry belonged to physics, that innovation could be appreciated across former battle lines, that understanding could follow violence when both parties chose calculation over continued enmity. Klaus and Carter wrote letters for years, discussed wing loading and control harmonics and the geometry of civilian flight, became friends in peace who had been enemies in war, proved mathematics created bridges where nationalism had built walls. April 1985. 40 years after the war ended, Carter was 66 years old now, living in Ohio, retired from aerospace engineering, designing small civilian aircraft, crop dusters mostly. Nothing famous, nothing that made headlines, just practical planes that solved practical problems through careful application of physics. He received a visit he did not expect. Air Force Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, 26 years old, F-16 Fighting Falcon pilot, requested a meeting. Carter agreed out of curiosity more than anything else. Johnson arrived in dress uniform, stood at attention in Carter's small living room, said, "Sir, I need to thank you. You saved my grandfather's bomber formation in January 1945. He was a waist gunner on a B-17. His formation where he was attacked by German fighters over Bavaria. American escorts used a maneuver my grandfather described as impossible. Said he watched a Mustang roll inverted and drop through an angle that made no sense. Said it disrupted the attack completely. Said the formation survived because of geometry he could not understand. My grandfather survived that mission. Met my grandmother after the war. My father was born in 1947. I was born in 1959. I exist because you developed mathematics that saved bombers 40 years ago, Johnson continued. But there is more, sir. I am an F-16 pilot, fighter weapons school graduate. We still study your maneuver. We call it the high-speed rolling reversal now, adapted for jet speeds and modern aircraft. But the principle is identical. Roll at high speed, transition inverted, control the descent angle, maintain energy, change geometry faster than the enemy can recalculate. I have used it in training exercises, have defeated opponents who expected standard maneuvers. Your innovation from 1944 is still saving pilots in 1980, still teaching us that the space between doctrine contains solutions. I wanted to meet the man who proved geometry defeats tactics. Wanted to thank you personally for a legacy that spans generations. Carter was deeply moved, had known the maneuver spread beyond his squadron, had known it became doctrine in Korea and Vietnam, but had not realized modern jet pilots still studied it, had not understood the mathematics had survived transition from propeller to jet, had not known families existed because of calculations he made in a Nissen hut in England 4 decades ago. Johnson showed him photographs. His grandfather in 1945, his father as a child, himself in an F-16 cockpit. 3 generations connected by geometry Carter had developed to save his brother, connected by mathematics that had become invisible through complete success, connected by innovation so thoroughly absorbed into doctrine that its origins were nearly forgotten. Carter said, "I did not do this alone. My brother's letters revealed the problem. My crew chief believed in the mathematics. My commander authorized training despite the deaths. My student mastered it and taught others. The legacy belongs to everyone who refused to accept that doctrine was finished, to everyone who understood that innovation required calculation rather than inspiration." Johnson said, "True, sir. But you started it. You calculated it first. You proved it could work. You taught it systematically. That matters. That changes everything. Without you, the innovation dies with the first attempt. With you, it becomes doctrine that saves lives for 40 years and counting. That is the difference between a good idea and a legacy." March 1998. Benjamin Carter died at 78. Heart failure. Peaceful death in his sleep. Small obituary in the local paper. Mentioned his service with the 361st Fighter Group. Mentioned his work in aerospace engineering. Mentioned his family. Did not mention the maneuver. Did not mention the geometry. Did not mention that he had changed fighter combat forever. Most people at the funeral did not know what he had achieved. A few did, stood in the back of the church. Older men wearing their service with quiet dignity. Some in Air Force uniforms. Some in civilian clothes. All understanding what Carter had proven, all knowing the geometry he developed had changed their profession forever. Helen Carter arranged military honors. Flag-draped coffin, honor guard, 3 volleys. Taps played as spring rain fell on Ohio farmland. But she requested something specific, something unusual. Requested a flyover, not the standard missing man formation. Something that would honor what Carter had actually accomplished. The Air Force understood, agreed immediately, understood the significance completely. 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons appeared over the cemetery, flew low at 2,000 feet. Thunder of modern jet engines drowning out everything else. Then the lead aircraft did something no one expected, except those who understood. The lead pilot rolled inverted, executed the maneuver Carter had pioneered 54 years earlier. High-speed rolling reversal, perfect form, transitioned smoothly, held the inverted position through the arc, then rolled back upright, rejoined the formation, disappeared into gray Ohio clouds. The pilot standing at the grave understood completely, stood at rigid attention, saluted, understood. The tribute was perfect. Was geometry honoring its architect? Was mathematics made visible one final time before becoming invisible again through complete integration into doctrine? David Carter delivered the eulogy, 80 years old now, voice steady despite emotion. He said, "My brother saved my life twice. First by developing a maneuver that changed how we fought. That innovation came from letters I wrote describing problems I saw from a ball turret. Ben took those problems and found solutions. found geometry that doctrine did not contain, found mathematics that defeated tactics. Second, he saved me by finding me after the war, by helping me understand that survival meant living and not just existing, by showing me that problems have solutions if you calculate correctly, by proving that doctrine is a starting point and not an ending point, by demonstrating that the space between standard approaches contains innovation that can save thousands of lives. David continued, he proved mathematics matters, proved geometry defeats tactics, proved one person who refuses to accept the impossible can change how thousands fly. He asked the right questions, found the right answers, taught the right lessons. Most importantly, he proved that innovation requires understanding rather than inspiration. That geometry can be taught, that mathematics can be transferred, that doctrine can evolve if we respect physics more than tradition. He mattered. His calculations mattered. His refusal to accept that the book was finished mattered. And because he mattered, thousands of pilots survived who would have died. Thousands of families remained whole who would have been broken. Thousands of lives were saved by geometry developed in a notebook by a man who trusted math more than instinct. After the service retired, fighter pilots gathered, exchanged stories about learning the maneuver, about teaching it to others, about using it in Korea and Vietnam, and training exercises over Nevada, about watching the geometry evolve from propellers to jets to fourth-generation fighters, about understanding that Carter's innovation had become so thoroughly integrated into doctrine that most pilots executed it without knowing its history. One colonel said the greatest honor is changing the rules so thoroughly that no one remembers different rules existed. Carter achieved this, changed fighter combat forever through mathematics, through refusing to accept that doctrine was complete, through calculating the space between maneuvers contains solutions. That is legacy. That is immortality through invisibility. Tommy Walsh attended the funeral, 82 years old, the first pilot besides Carter to master the maneuver, had taught it to hundreds, became chief instructor at Fighter Weapons School, retired as a full colonel. He spoke to the younger pilots present, said that maneuver nearly killed me when I tried it without understanding. Then it saved my life a dozen times once I learned the mathematics. Then it became the foundation of my teaching career. Carter taught me that physics matters more than instinct, that understanding margins means being able to touch them safely. That innovation requires calculation rather than courage alone. I taught this principle to students for 40 years. They teach it now to their students. His geometry lives in every fighter pilot who rolls inverted at the top of a climb, lives in every tactical manual, lives in the understanding that the impossible is just mathematics waiting for the right person to solve it. He was the right person. We remember because his mathematics became our doctrine. His innovation became our standard. His geometry became invisible through complete success. Charlie Morrison had died in 1987, but his son attended, brought his father's notebook. Original diagrams Carter had sketched in 1943. Calculations for stress loads during inverted maneuvers. Notes Morrison had made after inspecting the aircraft. Evidence of the partnership between pilot and mechanic. Evidence that innovation required trust between those who calculated and those who maintained. The son donated the notebook to the Air Force Museum. Said his father had always believed in Carter's mathematics, had always known the geometry would work if executed precisely, had always maintained the aircraft to tolerances Carter's calculations required, said the partnership made innovation possible, said the legacy belonged to both men. Klaus Werner sent a letter from Germany, too old to travel, too ill to make the journey, but wrote words that were read at the service. The letter said Captain Carter and I were enemies. War demanded we try to kill each other. He succeeded at his mission better than I succeeded at mine. Not through luck, but through superior understanding of physics. After the war, we became colleagues, corresponded about aviation for 30 years. He taught me what he had developed. I taught him what we had learned trying to counter it. We proved that enemies can become friends when war ends. Proved that geometry belongs to physics and not to nationalism. Proved that innovation deserves respect regardless of which side develops it. I honor his memory, honor his mathematics, honor his refusal to accept doctrine as gospel. He changed warfare, changed how we think about aerial combat, changed what is possible when someone calculates correctly. That is greatness measured not in fame, but in fundamental transformation of how everyone operates. The headstone was simple. Name, rank, date, service record. No mention of the maneuver. No technical diagrams. No explanation of geometry. Just facts. But the ground around the grave showed the truth. Pilots left tributes, slide rules, protractors, diagrams of rolling reversals, calculations scribbled on paper, notes saying thank you, notes explaining how his geometry had saved their lives, how his mathematics had saved their students, how his innovation had preserved the tradition of tactical evolution. The grave became a pilgrimage site for fighter pilots, a place to remember that mathematics matters, that physics defeats tactics, that one person calculating correctly can change everything. His maneuver is still taught, still studied, still executed by fighters rolling inverted at high speed over battlefields he never knew existed. His name is mostly forgotten, except by historians and pilots who study the origins of doctrine. But that invisibility is the highest form of success, means the innovation worked so completely, it became standard, became what everyone does without questioning, became foundation rather than exception. That was Carter's legacy, not fame, not recognition, but fundamental change in how aerial combat is fought. Change so complete it became invisible. Change that saved thousands of lives across 7 decades. Change that proved refusing to accept that the book was finished could rewrite the book entirely. Change that demonstrated the space between standard maneuvers contained solutions that could defeat any tactic. Change that mattered forever. Through mathematics, through geometry, through one man's refusal to accept that doctrine was complete. Through Benjamin Carter's understanding that physics could defeat instinct when physics was applied with absolute precision and absolute refusal to accept the impossible as an answer.